Prince Edward has just made a move so bold that the palace is scrambling to keep it buried. He has shut Camilla out, along with every person in her inner circle, from William's coronation. And at the heart of this escalating power struggle is a single brooch. Royal watchers are calling it the most audacious display of authority Camilla has ever attempted. Edward saw exactly what she was doing, and he responded with precision. Step by calculated step, he is dismantling every piece of influence she has spent decades carefully building. And what he is preparing to do next is so targeted, so deeply personal, that she may never truly recover. The frame she was left out of. On Easter Sunday 2026, Windsor Castle felt different. Every camera in Britain was pointed at the same moment, waiting. And then a single photograph was captured, one that sent tremors through the palace that no one had anticipated. Prince William entered St. George's Chapel with Catherine at his side. Their 3 children moved with them like a shield. After years of illness, prolonged absence, and quiet speculation that the Wales family was slowly unraveling, they had returned united, composed, and unshakable. The crowd was transfixed. Standing directly beside William was Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, with his son James close by. Princess Anne was positioned nearby, Peter Phillips just a step away. Every single one of them had formed a tight ring around William like a fortress that had already been built, brick by brick, before anyone else realized what was happening. Now look for Camilla in that frame. Go ahead, look carefully. The people who had long occupied her side of the royal picture were simply not there. Andrew, the disgraced brother she had never publicly distanced herself from, despite everything the world had come to know about him, was absent. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, did not appear either. The familiar faces that had always hovered near her orbit were gone. And the people who remained, William, Catherine, Edward, Anne, had drawn themselves into one tight, deliberate formation on the opposite side of that chapel. Nothing in that photograph was a coincidence. At an event of this magnitude at Windsor Castle, with the full weight of the monarchy on display, every placement is predetermined. Every position carries intention. Someone decided who would stand where, and someone decided that Camilla's people would not be standing there. That photograph was not simply a picture. It was a statement. It said she was out. It said the walls had quietly closed around her. It said that the people now steering the future of the monarchy had looked in her direction and made a decision. And the most damning part, every bit of it traced back to choices Camilla herself had made. 30 years of calculated moves, 30 years of crossed lines and pushed boundaries. She had built her own enemies, one decision at a time, and now those enemies were arranging themselves around the next king without her. But what exactly triggered this particular moment? What pushed Edward and the rest of the family past the point of tolerance? It started with a brooch, and what that brooch represented was far more dangerous than it looked. In February 2023, during a visit to Brick Lane in East London, Camilla stepped into public wearing a piece of jewelry that made royal insiders go completely still. It was a brooch crafted in the shape of the Tudor crown, a silver frame inlaid with sapphires, rubies, and emeralds, pressed together like a quiet declaration of something enormous. Here is why that stopped people cold. The Tudor crown is the central symbol on King Charles III's official royal cipher. It is the emblem of his authority as sovereign, his identity, his reign, his power, rendered in metal and stone. And Camilla pinned it to her chest and walked out in front of the world. Royal jewelry experts have long been unambiguous about what brooches communicate in palace life. They are not mere accessories. Worn near the heart, they carry deliberate messages about loyalty, identity, authority, and permanence, messages that no speech could ever deliver as cleanly. And this particular brooch carried a message so clear it required no words whatsoever. It said, "I am not simply standing beside the king. I carry his crown. I am here to stay. I am not going anywhere." senior palace aides were blindsided, not because the brooch existed, but because of how openly, how unapologetically she wore it. Because that brooch was not Camilla honoring the monarchy.
It was Camilla telling the monarchy precisely where she planned to plant her feet permanently. But that was not even the moment that made people's blood run cold. When Charles was crowned in May 2023, Camilla entered that ceremony adorned with jewels drawn directly from Queen Elizabeth II's most intimate personal collection. The crown resting on her head had been reset with the Cullinan III, IV, and V diamonds, stones Queen Elizabeth had worn as a brooch for decades, stones she had privately called Granny's chips. These were not formal ceremonial display pieces kept behind glass in some palace vault. They were Elizabeth's own cherished belongings, objects the entire country had watched sit on her body for 70 years. And the grief over Elizabeth was still completely raw. The nation had not finished mourning her. Royal watchers described the moment as a gut punch. The palace framed it as a tribute to history. But what the public witnessed was a woman who had spent 30 years being despised reaching into a dead queen's jewelry box on the very day she claimed her crown. And something inside millions of people went ice cold and did not warm back up. Because here is what made it so much darker. Camilla was not just wearing jewels. She was wearing the armor of a woman the country was still actively grieving. A woman who had spent 7 decades as the quiet, composed, dignified opposite of everything Camilla had ever represented. The British public never forgot who Camilla was before the titles, before the rehabilitation campaigns, before the carefully managed image makeovers. They never forgot Diana. They never forgot the woman who had shattered one of the most beloved marriages in modern royal history. The woman Diana herself described as her nightmare. That wound never healed. And every single time Camilla reached for something that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone more beloved, more mourned, more missed, that wound cracked open and bled all over again. And here is where it gets darker still. Because the harshest verdict on Camilla did not come from the press or the public or palace insiders speaking anonymously. It came from inside her own family. Harry said it plainly in his own memoir in his own words. He called Camilla dangerous, he called her self-serving. He wrote that she fed stories to the tabloids and constructed her own public image on the wreckage of the people closest to her. He described her as someone who needed a PR campaign built on the suffering of others to survive. He used the word villain, and that word did not come from a critic or a journalist or a stranger with an agenda. It came from her own stepson. A man who had watched her operate from the inside up close for years and decided the world deserved to know exactly what he had seen. By 2026, the numbers confirmed everything Harry had put into writing. Camilla's public approval had collapsed to 42%, the lowest point recorded since March 2021, and the proportion of the British public who actively viewed her with hostility had climbed to 45%. Now set that beside Prince Edward, a man 15th in line to the throne, a man so deliberately low profile for 3 consecutive decades that most of the country had practically forgotten he existed. His approval rating sat between 50 and 51%. Only 19% of the public viewed him negatively. A man nobody had watched for 30 years was now more trusted, more liked, and more respected than the woman wearing the crown. And inside a monarchy where public approval is not merely a matter of image, where it translates into real political leverage, real influence, real access to power, that gap was not just a statistic. It quietly, decisively changed who got listened to in closed rooms. It changed who shaped decisions. It changed who got left standing outside the door. Camilla felt that shift. She sensed the ground moving beneath her. She just had no idea yet how completely, how suddenly it was about to swallow her whole. And the person who would pull her deepest into that darkness was not an enemy who had always opposed her. He was not a stranger. He was not a rival from outside the family walls. He was family, and that made everything he was about to do so much worse. That person was Prince Andrew, and his collapse was the crack that broke Camilla's footing entirely. The crisis that shifted everything. Andrew was not simply pushed aside. He was taken apart piece by piece in front of the entire world. At 66 years old, he was forced out of Royal Lodge, the grand Georgian mansion in Windsor he had called home since 2004. That house was never just a building, it was evidence. It was proof that the family had chosen to keep him inside the walls despite everything the world had learned about him, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, the sexual abuse allegations, the catastrophic BBC interview that made every single thing worse. That proof was revoked. He was relocated to Wood Farm, a far smaller and deeply secluded property tucked away on the Sandringham estate. Then, in January 2025, King Charles formally stripped him of his remaining titles. The message was brutal in its clarity. There was no road back. But here is where Andrew's collapse reached Edward in a way that nobody discussed publicly. For years, Edward and Sophie had maintained a quiet, private tradition, spending Easter at Wood Farm. It was never a public engagement. It was a family ritual, steady and personal and entirely theirs. Andrew's prolonged presence there made it impossible to continue. The visit was cancelled. And in a life built on routine, on loyalty, on doing the right thing without ever making noise about it, that kind of disruption landed far harder than it appeared from the outside. What Edward did next revealed exactly the kind of man he is. Reports confirmed that Edward was the first senior royal to visit Andrew following his arrest in February on suspicion of misconduct in a public office. And here's the detail that should stop you completely. King Charles was 1 mile away at Sandringham when it happened. 1 mile. His own brother had just been arrested and Charles did not go. Edward went. But he did not go to sit beside Andrew in solidarity. He did not go to offer comfort or companionship. He went to end it. He pushed Andrew directly and firmly to accelerate his departure from Wood Farm, to stop prolonging the situation, to stop letting the damage bleed outward and stain everyone around him. That visit was not brotherly love. Edward walked in, delivered what needed to be said, and walked back out without flinching. That is the man who stood beside William on Easter Sunday. A man who had just walked into his own brother's crisis, said the hard and uncomfortable thing nobody else would say, and left without looking back. The work nobody rewarded. When Charles's cancer diagnosis forced him to significantly scale back his public duties, Edward and Sophie stepped forward, without being asked, without being instructed, without waiting for permission. They took on solo international tour across Papua New Guinea and Japan. High-visibility engagements where they represented the king and the entire United Kingdom with no safety net, no backup, and no guarantee of recognition. They were holding up a monarchy that could not fully function without them. And then Charles released his April 2024 honors list. The list that was supposed to reflect who had shown up, who had carried the weight, who had kept things moving when everything threatened to fall apart. Queen Camilla was on it, Prince William was on it, Princess Catherine was on it, all recognized, all included, all rewarded. Edward and Sophie were not mentioned, not once, not after any of it. The omission was so glaring that royal commentators flagged it publicly and loudly. The press noticed, the public noticed, and Edward and Sophie responded with complete silence. Not one word, not one expression of frustration or disappointment. They simply kept going at exactly the same pace with exactly the same commitment as before. Inside the palace, that kind of response is not weakness. It is the most quietly devastating move available, because loyalty that demands absolutely nothing in return is far rarer and far more powerful than any name printed on an honors list. But here is the detail that changed everything about what Edward did next. While he and Sophie were being erased from that list, after doing more than almost anyone else in the institution, Camilla's inner circle was being shielded and rewarded. Her people were untouched, protected, elevated. That was not an oversight, that was a message. It said clearly and deliberately that no matter how much Edward and Sophie showed up and sacrificed, Camilla's circle would always be placed above them. Edward received that message. He understood precisely what it meant. And from that moment forward, his loyalty stopped being something he distributed equally across the institution. He directed it deliberately, irreversibly toward one person, the one person he believed would one day recognize it and return it in kind. That person was William. But something even more personal was fueling him beneath the surface. For years, the people inside Camilla's orbit, the figures palace insiders had long referred to as the Rottweilers, controlled access within those palace walls. They decided which stories reached the press and which ones were quietly buried. And Sophie felt the full, suffocating weight of that machine. She was never welcomed into Camilla's circle. Stories, unflattering, calculated, damaging stories, were fed to the tabloids about her. Edward watched his wife endure that for years. He watched Sophie show up every single day, do the work, carry herself with complete dignity, and still be treated like an outsider inside her own family. He said nothing publicly, he made no scenes, he gave no interviews. But something inside him hardened during those years, and it never softened again. And then the honors list came, and Sophie's name was nowhere on it. After everything, after all of it, Edward did not explode. He did not confront anyone. He did not make a single public statement. He did something far more dangerous. He chose a side, deliberately, permanently, and he made absolutely certain the palace could see exactly which side he had chosen. Right now, that choice is proving to be the right one. Because Camilla's operation, the machine she spent 30 years assembling, is beginning to rot from within. 30 years of calculated moves had quietly turned exactly the wrong people into her enemies at exactly the block nobody saw coming. When William becomes king, he builds his coronation from scratch. He decides who walks in that procession, who sits in the front row, whose face appears on that balcony. Camilla has no automatic right to any of it, not a single thing. Her entire position exists only because Charles built it for her and fought for it personally. The moment Charles is gone, every bit of that protection vanishes with him. That is where Edward comes in. Every time he positioned himself inside William's visible circle at Easter, at state occasions, in every formation the cameras captured, he was helping draw the map of William's future court. And on that map, Camilla does not have a seat near the throne. The people around William are building his future right now. They are building it entirely without her. That is the block, and it was already finished before Camilla even realized it had begun. Under William, she becomes Queen Mother in title only, a ceremonial role with no structural power and no guaranteed place in anything that actually matters. And remember those brooches, the Tudor crown brooch she pinned to her chest, the Cullinan diamonds she pulled from Elizabeth's personal collection and reset into her own coronation crown. She wore all of it as a declaration of permanence, but every piece of that power was borrowed. It came from Charles. It survived only because Charles remained on the throne. When William opens those vaults for his coronation, his people decide what comes out and who gets to wear it. Camilla will have no say. She will sit wherever William's people place her. Those diamonds go to Catherine. Camilla will not be touching them again. And through all of it, Edward stays exactly where he has chosen to stand beside William. Every appearance was a vote. Every placement was a statement. Sophie's carefully targeted absences delivered the same message differently. She skipped precisely the events where being present would have placed her inside Camilla's circle. Every absence was deliberate. Every absence landed exactly where it was meant to. Together, Edward and Sophie had already chosen, before anyone asked them to, before it became necessary. And they made absolutely sure the palace could see it.